Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Samuel Culper.
Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to Out Front with Samuel Culper. I'm your host, Samuel Culper. And today we're talking about the 10 measurable factors of insurgencies. We're going to run through these 10 factors and see how today's urban insurgencies are stacking up here. Before we get to insurgency, though, does anybody else find this UFO stuff fascinating? I do. I'm a huge fan of UFOs and aliens. I'm not exactly sure what I believe about the existence of aliens, but it certainly is interesting to follow along. There's an interview last month where Senator Marco Rubio said that he was concerned that China or Russia had, quote-unquote, made some technological leap. And basically he was saying, maybe it's China or Russia. They're flying these aircraft that are being observed over U.S. military bases. And then, of course, you have the aliens people. So I was reading an article earlier today on, where it was, doesn't matter. But there was a defense contractor who apparently this guy has been vetted. He's, his bona fides have been confirmed, but he says he was a defense contractor, and he gave a classified briefing to the Defense Department, and he talked about, quote, off-world vehicles not made on this earth, end quote. Super cool stuff. Maybe the truth is out there, as they say. All right. So let's get into this insurgency stuff today. There's this interesting piece of an article written by Ronald Brownstein, which was published in The Atlantic. And I don't know, it's basically a bunch of pablum. But then you get to the very bottom, and here's what he has to say. Quote, and if Trump wins a second term, he writes, the chaos in Portland might look like only the preliminary skirmish for an even more incendiary collision to come, end quote. And that's one thing that a lot of people have been warning about. I've been talking about that. What is the left going to do if President Trump wins in November? Of course, Mitt Romney came out yesterday and said that he thinks President Trump is likely to be reelected, and we'll go into that. We'll go into that in today's early warning podcast immediately following this show, where we talk about early warning. By the way, if you don't get our daily reports, you can go to forwardobserver.com/subscribe and join up. We're on Monday. It's going to blow people's minds what we're putting up. All right, so let's get back to insurgencies here. Is the insurgency going to worsen? Are these urban insurgencies? There's one in Portland. Someone just asked me today if Seattle was going to experience an urban insurgency. I think the answer is a near certainty, because the Trump administration, they just sent federal troops, not federal troops. They've sent, NPR called them this morning. NPR said they were federal security forces. At any rate, the feds are going into Seattle because this weekend is going to be there's going to be 37 protests, at least 37 protests in 22 states on Saturday, organized by some militant anarchists. And Seattle is one of those places where, if three people get together, there's going to be a riot. And so is there going to be an insurgency in Seattle like we're seeing in Portland? Quite possibly, especially with those federal troops coming in, or not, especially with the federal law enforcement guys coming in. Sorry. All right. Well, Brigadier General Samuel Griffith, he was a Marine Corps general. He wrote the foreword to, this was published back in the 60s. I found this older copy of Mao's On Guerrilla Warfare, and Brigadier General Griffith wrote the foreword, and he also translated this particular version. And in the foreword, he writes about his in-depth study of partisan and communist resistance and guerrilla movements. And one of the things that I find particularly interesting about this book is how he describes how guerrilla movements are executed. And I think that can be applied to today's insurgencies as well. Guerrilla action can be part of an insurgency, but guerrilla action can also occur outside of an insurgency. So sometimes people conflate the two, or they describe the two. They really don't understand what the difference is. An insurgency is a conflict. Guerrilla warfare or guerrilla action, that is more of a type of action that can occur inside an insurgency or outside an insurgency. In this case, Brigadier General Griffith talks about guerrilla warfare outside of an insurgency, but I think that can be applied to a broader insurgency. So at any rate, he describes 10 factors that determine the outcome of guerrilla and resistance movements. Neat. Here's what he has to say, quote, well, let's just start this off. A couple of years ago, I started making a big deal about popular support, about how if there's any type of insurgency, any type of resistance or revolution that were to occur in the United States, on the left or on the right, those belligerents would need to gain popular support. Well, how much popular support is required? Well, I cited Brigadier General Samuel Griffith. Here's what he had to say about that. Quote, historical experience suggests that there's very little hope of destroying a revolutionary guerrilla movement after it has survived the first phase and has acquired the sympathetic support of a significant segment of the population. The size of this significant segment will vary. A decisive figure might range from 15 to 25%, end quote. And what General Griffith is saying here is that once these armed belligerents, once these armed revolutionaries have gained support, the active or passive support, from at least 15 to 25% of the surrounding population, then, quote, there's very little hope of destroying, end quote, that guerrilla movement or that insurgent movement. So I look at Portland. Does Portland have, first of all, let's talk about the 3 phases of insurgency. Okay, there's the first phase, which is where actually all the urban insurgencies are right now, which is latent and incipient, the latent and incipient phase of insurgency. Just because they're phase 1 does not mean that they will ever get out of phase 1. They may not ever get to phase 2 or phase 3. But in phase 1, they're recruiting, they're organizing, they're identifying leadership, they're building these institutions that are going to be required to sustain revolutionary or insurgent activity. And then in phase 2, that's when you get guerrilla war. That's actually where you get armed conflict, guerrilla warfare. And then phase 3, once the insurgency gains so much support, or once they wear down the government to a point where the guerrilla forces, the insurgent forces, can then begin clearing and holding territory, then you move to the third phase, which is war of movement / kind of more conventional type of warfare, where in effect the insurgents become the government, and now the insurgents have to hold this territory that they've conquered. So again, just because I repeatedly say that Portland is in phase 1 of a 3-phase insurgency, I'm not implying that they will ever get to phase 2 or phase 3. They may not. But just the mere fact that we're seeing lots of behaviors that indicate that they are in phase 1 of insurgency is both disappointing and exciting, because I'll tell you, I've been waiting a long time. I left my job in 2012 in the intelligence community because I was concerned about where the United States was headed. And we finally gotten to a point. Up until now, this insurgency has just developed so slowly. And now we're finally at a point. It's like, hey, all this stuff that we practice in Iraq and Afghanistan as an intel guy, all of a sudden, I have legit use for it now here in the United States. And that is somewhat disappointing. It's also exciting because this is my job and I really love doing this stuff. And now I get a chance through Forward Observer to do this every single day. All right. If Portland cannot sustain that 15 to 25% popular support in the area, then they will likely fail. Back during the Occupy Wall Street movement, that was incredibly disruptive, but that movement ultimately failed. And why did it fail? Some people say, well, it failed because it started getting cold outside. Fall turned to winter, and a bunch of those people didn't want to stay outside when it's 30 or 40 degrees outside, and so they all up and left. They quit. Well, that may be one explanation, but I would offer this other explanation, and that is they lost popular support for their actions. They maintained popular support for the cause. The cause was corruption, federal bailouts, making Wall Street richer, saving Wall Street, et cetera, bailing out the bankers. That was the criticism of that, the opposition to that was very, very popular. But they lost popular support when they became so disruptive that they started disrupting the lives of average Americans, like destroying businesses and sitting out in front of these office buildings and blocking traffic and trying to sabotage and disrupt other parts of the city that had nothing to do with Wall Street. They started to lose popular support. And I remember writing back then, I think that was probably the tipping point in the collapse of the Occupy Wall Street movement. When they started pissing a bunch of people off through their activities, they started losing active support. And so I look at what's going on in Portland, and not just in Portland. Portland is the most advanced case. But what these revolutionaries and these anarchists and revolutionaries are trying to do in other places. The question is, are they active enough to build a movement and to recruit and to organize, but are they doing it so much that they begin eroding any support that they have? So that's the first question I have about Portland. Right now they're picking up steam because they have a whole lot of people out there. This is like very typical cat and mouse kind of counterinsurgent behavior. In an insurgency, every single day you wake up as an insurgent and you should ask yourself, how can I bait the counterinsurgents into overreacting? How can I get them to go out and accidentally kill a civilian? How can I go out and get them to wreak havoc on the civilian populace looking for insurgents? Because an insurgency is basically, it's a parallel war. It's a war among the people. And basically through an insurgency, you try to replace the government through withdrawing popular support from the government. Because what is legitimacy? Legitimacy ultimately is having people believe that the government has authority and the government has a rightful place to be the government. Well, you withdraw that consent, or you force the government to delegitimize itself by attacking civilians or overreacting or killing some protesters or whatever. And then all of a sudden people start going, I don't know about this. Maybe these guys aren't the people we actually want in charge. And I'm not saying this is exactly what's going on in Portland, but then the people, they start saying, well, there's a shadow government set up by these insurgents, and we like their cause, we like what they're standing against, we like that, and that's how the insurgency starts to turn the tide in overthrowing and replacing the established government. Now, whether or not that's happening in Portland, I think there's some cases, there's an argument there that is what's happening. Certainly in the Chaz or the CHOP out in Seattle, the autonomous zone. I mean, what is that other than overthrowing the government's authority for that area? In Portland, these folks are abolitionists. They want to abolish the state. They are revolutionary. They are anarchists. And I'm uncertain that they actually have any potential whatsoever to actually do that. But it is concerning, and it should be concerning for the Trump administration, that those people are out there and they are accruing popular support. They're getting the moms out there and they're getting the dads out there. against, to protest police brutality and the Gestapo and all these other things that they're calling the federal law enforcement these days. That's popular support. They're building popular support for themselves against the federal government or against these federal law enforcement officers. Have they achieved 15 to 25% of the support from Portland? Well, I don't have any hard data. I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue against that. I think they have at least 15 to 25%. Again, I'm not from Portland. I don't have an intimate understanding of Portland other than, it's obviously a leftist stronghold. I would imagine they have eclipsed at least that 15 to 25%. So they have, first of all, they have the prerequisite condition, right? They have some popular support. What they do with it, if they continue to build it or they begin to erode that, is really up to them and their activities. What would happen if the federal government largely withdrew? Or what would happen if Portland PD said, okay, look, feds out, we're going to protect the federal courthouse, and feds, you can go away because we're going to do this. What would happen to that insurgency? I don't know. I don't imagine a lot of the moms and dads who are out there would stay out there. This kind of goes back to, one thing we put out in the early warning brief today is Portland an example of a counterinsurgency campaign, or is it being done for political effect because President Trump wants images of rioters and lawlessness plastered on TV screens for the next 100 days? It's a fair question. And my conclusion is there likely is some desire for political effect here. Because we're not seeing, look, the kinetic part, the law enforcement part, the military action part or paramilitary law enforcement action part of a counterinsurgency, that's only one part of a counterinsurgency campaign. You've got a lot of other stuff that I'm just not seeing happen out there. Now, granted, my boots aren't on the ground, but it does not look like a traditional counterinsurgency campaign to me. It's missing a lot of stuff. That leads me to believe that maybe it's not a counterinsurgency campaign, and maybe it is for the cameras, or maybe it's it's obviously to protect federal property. But I'm also leaning towards the Trump campaign finding that very politically advantageous. All right, so we'll move on. So here's the first. There are 10 factors. Here's the first factor. Number 1, appeal of program. Does the populace, let's just take Portland for an example. Does the populace line up behind these anarchists in Portland? I think the answer is yes to the degree that there are federal law enforcement officers out there wearing camouflage, doing these snatch and grabs. And by the way, these protesters, they're not being disappeared. They're being taken to the federal courthouse or the county courthouse, and they're being booked. They're being processed. Most of them have been let go, like within a matter of hours. If these dudes were getting disappeared, you'd never find them. They'd be in a ditch somewhere. So they're not being disappeared. They're being arrested. Staying under appeal of program. Does the insurgency in Portland right now, do the insurgents represent ideological and moral values to which the populace would subscribe? In other words, the populace, the section of the people who are lining up behind these anarchist insurgents, do they support the ideology and the moral values of those insurgents? In other words, would the people who were lined up on the streets last night, well, for the last 50 plus nights, would they be willing to risk their lives in support of that ideology? And again, I can't answer for sure because I'm not there and I don't know these groups on an intimate basis. I don't know them biblically or otherwise. Okay, next. Do the Do the anarchist insurgents have the moral high ground? And do the people believe in what they are doing? So basically what we're doing here is building a case here. What is the appeal of the insurgency here to the populace? Is this something the populace can get behind? To a degree, I think the answer is yes. I could be wrong. From what I think I understand, the moms and dads aren't out there protesting against federal law enforcement. They're not anarchists themselves, probably not by and large. They just want they want to oppose and resist federal law enforcement there in the city. Again, if federal law enforcement leaves Portland, a lot of that support is going to diminish, it seems to me. Moving on. Once these insurgents have established an appeal to program, once they have a cause that people can believe in and line up behind and begin actively supporting, they are building popular support. And gaining popular support is the keystone to any resistance or guerrilla or insurgent movement. Because from the populace, that's where you get your auxiliary and underground. That's where you get all your support guys from, in effect, is from the populace. That's your active recruitment pool. And the larger the pool, the more active support you're going to be able to garner for your movement, for these folks in Portland. Popular support occurs when insurgents can do one or more of two things. Number one, if there's aggrievement in shared sacrifice or shared persecution or shared oppression, then you're going to get more people. The more people oppressed, then the more people you're going to have who might be willing to work towards your common goal. This is like a football team and the fans, right? The better a football team does, the more fans they're probably going to attract. The closer they get to the Super Bowl, the more excitement they're going to build up by their fans. And this is not the greatest analogy, but think of it this way. Okay, like the Bengals, or I don't know. I haven't watched NFL in so long, but whatever the worst team there is out there, right? I mean, look at their fan base. Probably not real large because they're not doing very well. The football team's not doing well. So the better the insurgent team does, the more likely it is that they're going to attract. If they have a very good cause, if they have an ideology and a set of moral values that people can really get behind, the more attention, the more popular support they're going to attract. That's essentially what I'm trying to get at. So aggrievement is the first thing. They have to sell, and then they have to have a common goal with the populace. Does the populace support the end state? Now, in Portland, the end state is, I guess, to eject all government, state, local, and federal government, because these people are anarchists. They're abolitionists. They want to abolish the state. They want to abolish police, abolish prisons, and they're a very fringe element. Again, I don't live in Portland. I can't imagine that a majority of Portland wants to abolish prisons. But hey, I could be wrong. I don't, that's just not my, AO out there. All right, moving on. So we have appeal of program, popular support. Moving on, quality of leadership. This is the third factor that determines a potential of an insurgency. There's this old saying that the army doesn't produce leaders; it refines them. I think that actually was in an old army ad some time ago. There is a necessity right now in Portland. There's a necessity for this insurgency to build leadership, or to identify leadership potential and develop leaders. Leadership builds out of popular support. As more and more people support the movement, not only is more leadership required, but the more people you have to choose from to become good leaders. Quality of leadership can absolutely determine outcomes in war, any type of conflict, in this case, insurgency. So if this insurgency in Portland wants to be successful, it should be identifying and choosing good leaders. Now, I know a lot of this anarchist stuff is like no hierarchy, so maybe, command and control is well, frankly, I don't understand it, again, because I don't live out there and I'm not, I'm not running sources and stuff out there. But that's one thing as an analyst looking at this insurgency in Portland, this urban insurgency, that's one thing I'm looking for. Are they developing quality leaders? And if they are, then that's an indicator that this insurgency has more potential. Moving on, after quality of leadership, quality of troops. Are these people trained in what they're trying to do? Do they have the basic skills required to carry out their mission? Are these people dedicated? Do they have superior resolve? Is there a training cadre? One of the things that we've seen both with anti-fascist groups and a lot of these armed leftist groups is a training cadre. I've talked about this many times over on the early warning side, the early warning podcast. We've seen lots of indicators of veterans, leftist veterans, either in the military, in the Army, Marine Corps, they have experience in Iraq or Afghanistan, or some of these anti-fascist folks who traveled to Rojava, they traveled to Kurdistan to fight with Syrians or to fight with Kurds against the Islamic State. And a lot of these people have legitimate combat bona fides. And then they come back either as a military veteran from Iraq or Afghanistan, or they come back as a veteran of the war against the Islamic State. They come back, and then they start teaching what they've learned in real combat. So is there a training cadre? Yes, in some instances, there is a training cadre who are exporting proven TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures. They're trying to establish and increase the quality of troops. So that's another thing I'm looking at as an analyst. Do the troops have the capacity to achieve the mission? And that's a big intelligence gap for me for Portland, again, because I'm not there. It would be interesting maybe to spend 2 weeks in Portland and get on the ground and maybe suss some of this stuff out for myself. Or I tell you, if you're in the Portland area, shoot me an email. Shoot me an email at sam@forwardobserver.com. And if you're willing to answer a few questions, maybe we can make better sense of this together. All right, next, moving on, is military efficiency. Okay, the quality of leadership plus the quality of troops combined to produce military efficiency. Now, again, this is General Griffith is talking here about military insurgencies and military counterinsurgencies, but I think there's a rough equivalent for what's happening in Portland. Not that they're going towards military efficiency, but call it resistance efficiency or something to that effect. What is their fighting capability? What's their resistance capability? What is their supply and logistics capability? These people are living amongst the populace. Are they able to effectively recruit and deploy forces or deploy fighters or deploy resistance fighters, if this actually were to advance to a phase 2 type of insurgency or advance to phase 2 in the insurgency? Again, they're in phase 1, so there's very little armed conflict, it seems so far. Moving on, internal unity. I have seen, there've been a number of leftist groups that have had internecine fighting. They've dissolved, they broke up. Red Guards is one of those here in Austin. Austin Red Guards, which is this armed revolutionary communist vanguard group. They broke up last year, at some point last year, because there was a whole bunch of fighting. Redneck Revolt as kind of an umbrella organization. They've broken up, and some of those groups became other things. So what is the internal unity like in Portland? What is their morale? Do they work together or are they fighting? How do people respond to leadership, or how do people respond to orders? so on and so forth. All right, we're running out of time. Moving on here. After internal unity, there's equipment. Good equipment is it can be a force multiplier. The better equipment you have, probably the better military efficiency you're going to have. So how are these folks equipped? Do they have sufficient access to food and water? Do they have medical supplies? Yes and yes. Radios and other communications devices? Yes. As a matter of fact, some of those federal law enforcement units out there reported that their communications were being jammed. Now, I can't independently verify that. It would not surprise me, because finding those operating frequencies, first of all, if they're encrypted, if you find these transmissions out on a frequency and they are encrypted, it's a pretty darn good indicator that is someone way above your pay grade. And so if you can transmit on those frequencies, then you may be able to, if you transmit on a higher power than those frequencies that are transmitting, you may be able to jam those communications. So that's something that federal law enforcement has said that they have experienced. So I don't know if that's special equipment, or I'm not sure how, right now I'm not sure exactly how they're doing that. So this is the next thing. This is the next metric. This is the next qualitative measurement of an insurgency. Moving on, operational terrain. Okay, what is Portland's operational terrain? Well, it's urban. That's their AO. That's their area of operations. Essentially, this is the battle space that the federal government and these insurgents are fighting over, or at least fighting in. So, how well do the insurgents know the operational terrain? Well, I'd say they're expert in it, because that's where they've lived. A lot of them probably their entire lives. Moving on, operational area communications. How do the belligerents in the urban insurgency, how do they communicate? Are they using radios? Are they using dead drops? Are they communicating face to face? Are they using encrypted email or some other kind of, some kind of clandestine communications? Can those communications be intercepted? Can they be disrupted? If so, then maybe, that's certainly a debilitating factor for the insurgency. If the insurgents are communicating unabated, if they're not having any problems, if their communications are both secure as they can be and as efficient as they can be given the level of security, then that is another factor in their potential for winning in an insurgency. And finally, sanctuary. What is the insurgents' sanctuary? In the early morning, whenever they get done writing, where do they go to? Are they being followed back to their apartment building? Actually, that's something I'd be very interested in learning. These rioters and agitators, when they go back, where are they going to? Does federal law enforcement have some kind of surveillance set up so where they can track these people going back to their homes or going back to their bed down locations or wherever they're going? I would be absolutely amazed if there was no effort to track these rioters as they leave that area. Maybe they're just camped out downtown. Maybe they just sleep on the sidewalk. I don't know. I'm not there. Where do they find sanctuary? Do they have sanctuary there? Or are they being hounded? I'm not necessarily talking about in Portland specifically now, but does an insurgent have somewhere to go to where he feels relatively safe? See, this was the big thing. This was the big thing about the GWAT, the Global War on Terrorism, because the whole strategy was you got to send troops into the places where these terrorists, where they feel safe, and you have to go make them feel very unsafe. And so the question is anything like that being done in Portland? I don't know. Well, if the insurgents in Portland have sanctuary, then that is another factor that can contribute to their success. So those are the 10 factors, very briefly: appeal of program, popular support, quality of leadership, quality of troops, military efficiency, internal unity, equipment, operational terrain, operational area communications, and sanctuary. So if you were to grade, let's say you live in Portland, or let's say you live in New York or Seattle or Austin or wherever. Let's just say that there's 10 factors and you were to grade your local urban insurgency on a scale of 1 to 10 for each of these factors. This gives you an index score of 100 possible points. Yes, there is a way that we can assign levels of measurement, a score of a 2 or a 3, a 5, a 7, a 10. And there is a way that we can build an index score and actually measure the strength of an insurgency. And I think this is a very good way to do that. 10 factors, 10 points apiece, total index score of 100. And I'll tell you what, if you live in Portland, you live in the Portland area, get at me. Holler at your boy. And let's talk about this. And maybe we can come up with as accurate a score as possible for this urban insurgency in Portland. And I'm telling you, now is the time to get read up on insurgency and counterinsurgency, because if President Trump wins, I do think this whole thing is just going to blow wide open. It's going to make J20, I think it will be far and above. I mean, these people have had 4 years now to organize and prepare for a second term for President Trump. J20 being January 20th, 2017, the inauguration day. They've had 4 years, and they haven't been sitting on their hands for 4 years. They've been recruiting, organizing. These people are funded, by the way. I think the whole thing's going to blow wide open. And I'm not talking about 1861 here. I'm talking about what's going on in Portland expanding to other cities. Now is the time to learn. Now is the time to become an intelligence analyst, become an intelligence collector, if you're not already. And here's the thing, it's not just you. Like, you got to go out and recruit people to do this, to join your team and to do this. There's not enough focus on intelligence in this community. And I've been doing this since I was in Afghanistan, running a blog about what I saw going on in the United States in 2011. And I've been teaching pretty much full time since 2013. And I've trained a ton of people, specifically people in the preparedness community who are concerned about lawlessness and EMPs and societal collapse and economic collapse and all this stuff. Training hundreds of them in person. And there's not enough intel guys in this community, I'm telling you. So we have to work on building this community, exporting these skills, intelligence gathering, intelligence analysis, because they make a difference. They will make a difference in your level of preparedness and your security planning. All right, I've gone way over on today's show. Hey, thanks for listening. If you're listening to the podcast version of this, number one, this is live, forwardobserver.fm, every day at 2 p.m. If you're listening to the podcast version, do me a solid if you like this show. If you want it to continue, give me a 5-star rating and review. I certainly would appreciate that. It would help us rise up in search results. Look, we got 100 days to reach as many people as we can to get them caught up on all this intel business. I mean, after 100 days, I'm going to continue doing this. But if things really do pop off after November, then I will probably have to dedicate some more of my time on the Forward Observer early warning side, and maybe a little bit less time to the show. We'll see. All right. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. I'll be back on this show Monday, 2 p.m. Central Time. Until then, have a good weekend. Be well and stay out front.